Welcome back, everyone. We are going to continue our study of the 70-week prophecy, and we ended on page 496 in our last session, and so now we are going to begin at the top of the page with the subtitle, The Cutting Off of the Messiah, but Not for Himself. Now let's read once again verse 25 so that we see what we've covered so far. Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the command to restore and build Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince, there shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. The street shall be built again, and the wall, we already noticed what the meaning of those words are, even in troublous times. And now we're going to take a look at verse 26. And after the 62 weeks, in other words, after the 7 and the 62 weeks, what is going to take place? Messiah is going to be cut off, but not for himself. So let's pursue that. All events in the previous section took place within the time frame of the first 7 weeks, which are 49 years. Then 62 weeks, that's 434 years later, the prophecy predicted that the Messiah would be cut off. What is the meaning of the expression cut off? For whom and why was the Messiah cut off? What is the meaning of the expression cut off, in other words? We find the answer to these questions in a parallel prophecy of Isaiah chapter 53. There are several terms in Daniel 9 that appear also in Isaiah 53. Notice some of those expressions and words that appear both in Daniel 9 and Isaiah 53. The word transgression, the word sin, the word iniquity, the word people, the word righteousness, and also the word or the expression cut off. Isaiah 53 verse 8 is strikingly similar to Daniel 9. Let's read Isaiah 53 and verse 8. He, that is the suffering servant, was taken from prison and from judgment. And who shall declare his generation? For he was what? This is a messianic prophecy. He was cut off out of the land of the living. In other words, he was killed, right? Cut off means he's killed. He was cut off from the land of the living. And for whom did he do it? Did he do it for himself? No, it says, for the transgression of my people was he stricken. So he was cut off, not for himself. And cut off means that he's cut off from the land of the living. In other words, he's killed. Clearly, the expression cut off means killed. And both prophecies indicate that he died for his people and not for himself. The altruistic death of the suffering servant is repeated in other verses of Isaiah 53. Not only does Isaiah 53 say that he was going to be cut off for the sins of his people, but notice what Isaiah 53 verses 3, 4, 5, 6, 11, and 12. I'm only including certain expressions in these verses. He hath borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. He was wounded for our transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement of our peace was upon him, and with his stripes we are healed. The Lord hath laid on him the iniquity of us all. He shall bear their iniquities. He was numbered with transgressors, and he bare the sin of many. So is it clear that he was cut off, but not for himself? I think there's enough evidence in all of these expressions. He did it for his people. And so let's go back to Daniel chapter 9. Immediately after saying, after 62 weeks, the Messiah shall be cut off, but not for himself, it speaks about the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary, and the end of it shall be with a flood, until the end of the war, desolations are determined. We have a lot to say about what I just read. The question is, who is the prince who is to come, and who are his people? Three possibilities have been suggested. Number one, the people are the Romans, and the prince is Titus. So Titus comes with the Roman armies, with his peoples, and he destroys the city. The second possibility is the futurist possibility, and that is that the prince is a future antichrist, and the people are his wicked followers. And the third option is that the people are the Jews, and the prince is Jesus Christ. We will concern ourselves only with options 1 and 3, because once we understand options 1 and 3, number 2 becomes totally irrelevant. It takes care of itself. Historicists in general, and Seventh-day Adventists in particular, have traditionally taught that the prince was Titus, and the people of the prince were the Roman legions, or the armies that accompanied Titus. Now, this view is tempting, but it does not harmonize with the literary structure of Daniel 9:24 through 27. Notice the following structural consideration. In verse 25, you have, know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the command to restore and build Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince. So is Messiah the Prince? Yes, Messiah is the Prince. And then when you continue reading in verse 26, it says, and after 62 weeks, Messiah, is that the same Messiah that we read of in verse 25? Yes, Messiah shall be cut off, but not for himself, and the people of the prince who is to come. So is it the same prince? Yes, it's the same prince. Verse 25 says, Messiah the prince, and then it speaks about Messiah, and then it refers to the prince who is to come. Are you following me or not? There's no reason to believe that Messiah the prince in verse 25 is not the same Messiah and prince in verse 26. In fact, the reference to Messiah and prince in verse 26 provides a literary balance with the reference to Messiah the prince in verse 25. So you have Messiah the prince, and then you have Messiah, and then you have the prince who is to come. A more serious problem with the view that the prince is Tyrus and the people, the Roman legions, is that it is incongruous with the three personal pronouns in verse 27. Verse 27 reads as follows. He, is that the same prince who is to come in the previous verse? Yeah, of course it is. There's no break. It's the same prince. He shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week. And in the midst of the week, he, the same prince of the previous verse, he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. And for the overspreading of abominations, he shall make it desolate. So is this he of verse 27 the same he as the prince who is to come in the previous verse? Absolutely. Now let's unpack this. The context clearly indicates that the three he's of verse 27 refer to the same person as the he in verse 26. That is to say, the prince of the people in verse 26 is the same person who confirms the covenant for 1 week, causes the sacrifice and oblation to cease, and makes the city and the sanctuary desolate. It is true that Titus literally caused the sacrificial system to come to an end because he destroyed the temple. However, it is not true that Titus made a strong covenant with Israel for 1 week, is it? That's not true. Seventh-day Adventists have traditionally believed that it was Jesus who brought the sacrifice and oblation to an end when he said on the cross, what? It is finished. Seventh-day Adventists have also believed that Jesus confirmed the covenant with Israel for the final of the 70 weeks. Don't we believe that? Of course we do. It is clear that the antecedent to all three he's in verse 27 is the prince who is to come in verse 26. This is the way it reads. The people of the prince that shall come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary, and he, the prince, the same one, shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week, and in the midst of the week, he, the prince, shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease, and for the overspreading of abominations, he, the same prince, shall make desolate. Are you following the argument here? Now, the difficult situation of understanding this way is that it gives the impression that Jesus, if you notice here, that the Jews destroyed Jerusalem. Let's pursue this. If the prince of verse 26 is Jesus, then the people of the prince must be whom? The Jews. The word people throughout Daniel 9 always refers to Israel, no exception, such as verses 15, 16, 19, 20, 24. Of course, the question that ensues is this: did the Jews, the people of the prince, destroy their own city and sanctuary? Are you understanding the problem here? Did the Jews destroy their own city and their own sanctuary? The idea appears to be absurd, but let's take a closer look. After all, the Jews did not destroy their own city or sanctuary. Titus and the Roman legions did. Or did they? It will help us to understand how the Jews destroyed their own city and sanctuary in AD 70 by comparing to the first destruction of Jerusalem by King Nebuchadnezzar. Who destroyed Jerusalem the first time? Was it God, Nebuchadnezzar, or Israel? Well, Daniel 9:14 explicitly states that it was God. 2 Chronicles 36:17-20 says that it was Nebuchadnezzar. And Daniel 9:11, 14, and 15 explains that Israel's sins caused the destruction of the city and the temple. Jeremiah warned what would happen if Israel refused to submit to the king of Babylon. God said in Jeremiah 28:23, "Thou shalt cause this city to be burned with fire." So who destroyed Jerusalem the first time? Was it God, Nebuchadnezzar, or Israel? The answer is yes. This is how it works out. Because of Israel's sins, God employed his servant Nebuchadnezzar to destroy the city and the temple. However, God would not have used Nebuchadnezzar had it not been for the sins of the people. In other words, Israel, because of her own sinful choices, brought destruction upon herself. Now let's take a look at the second destruction of Jerusalem. One thing is absolutely clear. This is an extremely important point now. One thing is absolutely clear in Daniel 9. The destiny of Jerusalem is inseparably linked with what happened to the Messiah, the Prince. In other words, what happens with Jerusalem is related with what happened to the Prince. Let's continue here. Twice in the literary structure, what happened to the Messiah is followed by the destruction of Jerusalem. Verse 26 explains that after the Messiah was cut off, Jerusalem would be destroyed. And in verse 27, Jerusalem was destroyed after the prince caused the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. Are you following this or not? So what happens to the Messiah determines what happens to Jerusalem, in other words. Does the New Testament shed any light on how the destiny of the Messiah is linked to the fate of the second destruction of Jerusalem. Well, let's pursue this. On the Sunday before the crucifixion, Jesus entered Jerusalem at his triumphal entry on a donkey. At the conclusion of this majestic event, Jesus entered the temple and cast out the money changers. At this point, Matthew referred to the temple as the temple of God, and Jesus called it my house. When Jesus entered, at the end of the triumphal entry, it's called the temple of God, and Jesus refers to the temple as my house. In the following 2 chapters, this is important, in the following 2 chapters, Jesus told a series of parables where he underlined that the Jewish nation was about to make the terrible mistake of rejecting him. Of particular significance is the parable of the vineyard in Matthew 21, 33 to 34, where Jesus reviewed the history of Israel in 5 stages. First stage tells us that God sent servants to Israel to gather fruit at harvest season, but Israel rejected the messengers. This first group of messengers refers to the messengers that were sent to Israel after the exodus from Egypt. And then God sends more servants. You can read it in this parable. Those more servants are the ones that are sent after the Babylonian captivity. Zerubbabel, Haggai, etc. And then they rejected those as well. So last of all, the parable says, he sent his own what? His own son. And what did they do? They threw him out of the vineyard and they killed him. The next stage is described as, because the wicked men killed the son, the city was destroyed and burned. And then the kingdom goes to the Gentiles. Jesus says, the kingdom will be taken from you and given to whom? And given to the Gentiles. Are you seeing the 5 stages here? So what is the determining factor in the gospel going to the Gentiles? It must mean that the Jewish nation, by the crucifixion of the Messiah, caused the destruction of their own city and the end of the theocracy. These 5 stages of Israel's history in Matthew 21, 33 to 34, parallel the same stages of Israel's history in Daniel 9. In other words, you have the same 5 stages in Daniel 9. Stage number 1, after God freed the people from Egypt, he sent them messengers, but they mocked and rejected them. You see this in Daniel chapter 9, in Daniel's prayer. Also in 2 Chronicles 36. Stage number 2. After the Babylonian captivity, God gave Israel another opportunity. 70 weeks, right? The city and the temple were rebuilt, and God gave them 70 weeks to bear fruit. During this period, God sent them additional messengers, many of them. Haggai, Zechariah, Zerubbabel, Joshua, the high priest, Ezra, Nehemiah, Malachi, John the Baptist. However, they also rejected these messengers and fell into apostasy. So who's next? So God sends his what? Jesus Christ, his own son. And what do? He's cut off by them. Now, because Israel rejected the Messiah, what happens? The Roman legions come, and they destroyed Jerusalem and the temple. And then what happens? The Gentiles then become the new Israel. No longer was the gospel message for the lost sheep of the house of Israel, because the 70 weeks have come to an end. When Stephen was stoned, the theocracy came to an end, and the gospel went to the Gentiles. Are you catching the picture or not? Does the destruction of Jerusalem have anything to do with the death of the Messiah? Yes. What caused the destruction of Jerusalem? Yes, the Roman legions destroyed Jerusalem. I know that. Yes, God destroyed Jerusalem, but who caused the destruction of Jerusalem? It was the rejection of the Messiah by the Jews. The striking parallel between Daniel 9, 26 and 27 and Matthew 21, 33 to 44 clearly indicates that the rejection of the Son by Israel resulted in the destruction of Jerusalem and the grafting in of the Gentiles as God's chosen nation. When Jesus left the temple, this is notable. Did you notice that the word desolate is used here when it speaks about the destruction of Jerusalem? Desolations are determined. Did you notice that? Notice this is very interesting. When Jesus left the temple for the last time, he pronounced the ominous words, "Behold, your house is left unto you desolate." Two details in this verse arrest our attention. First, the temple was no longer the temple of God. He refers to it as your house. And Jesus referred it to your house. Second, the appearance of the key word desolate. This is the word that appears in Daniel 9 to describe the fate of Jerusalem for rejecting the Messiah. 3 times in Daniel 9, the text predicted that Jerusalem would be left how? Desolate. And by the way, Jesus referred to this in Matthew chapter 24, verse 15, when he said, "When you shall see the abomination of desolation," that was spoken of by Daniel the prophet. And Luke 21, verse 20, explains, "When you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies." So the abomination of desolation is when the Roman armies come against the city of Jerusalem because of the rejection of the Messiah. Significantly, immediately after Jesus pronounced these chilling words, notice this, after Jesus says, "Your house is left unto you desolate," what does he talk about in Matthew 24? The destruction of Jerusalem in verses 1 to 3. Is there a connection between the rejection of the Messiah and the destruction of Jerusalem? Absolutely. Certainly no one can miss the connection between the rejection of the Messiah and the destruction of Jerusalem. Only a willful and unexplainable blindness could fail to help us see how the rejection of the Messiah, the Prince, led to the destruction of the city and the temple. So who is the Prince who is to come? Is it some future Antichrist that is going to sit in a rebuilt Jerusalem temple? No, the Prince who is to come is the same Messiah, the Prince of previous verses. The same Messiah. Notice the link also in Luke 19, 41 to 44. "And when he was come near," Jesus is coming, he's going to enter through the east gate of Jerusalem. "He beheld the city and wept over it, saying, If thou hast known, even thou, at least in this thy day, the things which belong unto thy peace, but now they are hid from thine eyes. For the day shall come upon thee, that thine enemies," referring to the Romans, "shall cast a trench about thee, and compass thee round, and keep thee in on every side, and shall lay thee even with the ground, and thy children with thee. And they shall not leave in thee one stone upon another." And now notice the last part of the verse. Critically important. Why? Why was the city going to be razed to the ground? "Because thou knowest not the time of thy visitation." Is that clear? Crystal clear. Can there be any doubt that the fate of Jerusalem is closely connected with the rejection of the Messiah? Let's focus for a few moments on the parable of Matthew 22, verse 1 through 14, because it also explains the reason why Jerusalem was destroyed the second time. Like the parable of Matthew 21, 33 to 46, which we looked at a few moments ago, God sent servants to Israel to invite them to the marriage of his Son. This first stage represents the Old Testament period when God sent prophets to prepare Israel for the arrival of the Messiah. Sadly, they rejected the invitation. After the sacrifice of Christ, in the parable, the sacrifice of Christ is represented by the sacrifice of oxen and fatted cattle that are killed. So after the sacrifice of Christ, we find further messengers being sent. Peter, Stephen, Paul, among others. But these were also what? Also rejected. So now notice in verse 7, the result of rejecting the messengers, rejecting Christ, who was killed, which is symbolized by the sacrifice of the oxen and fatted cattle, and the rejection of the messages of those who proclaimed the message after the death of Christ. It says, but when the king, who is God the Father, by the way, when the king heard thereof, what they had done, that they'd rejected the message, he was wroth. And he sent forth his armies and destroyed those murderers and burned up their city. Who burned up the city? Was it the Roman legions or was it the king, God? Yes. God allowed the Romans to go and destroy the city. So does the rejection of the Messiah have anything to do with the destruction of Jerusalem? It's clear as day. But for some incredible blindness called by the devil, the futurists believe that the prince who is to come is a future Antichrist. They are putting Antichrist where Christ should be. That is serious, to put Antichrist where Christ is found in the text. Three ideas coalesce in this verse, which is Matthew 22, verse 7. Three ideas. God sent the Roman armies to destroy those murderers and to burn their city. The people, by rejecting the Messiah, brought destruction upon their own city. God destroyed the city through the instrumentality of Titus and the Roman legions, but it was the choice of the Jewish nation that determined its fate. Notice Ellen White understood this. I don't know why we still persist in saying that it was Titus and the Roman legions that are being spoken about. The prince is Titus and the people are his armies. Notice Ellen White is explicit. The Jews had forged their own fetters. Who? The Jews had forged their own fetters. They had filled for themselves the cup of vengeance in the utter destruction that befell them as a nation, and in all the woes that followed them in their dispersion. They were but reaping the harvest which their own hands had sown. Says the prophet, O Israel, thou hast destroyed thyself. Who destroyed Jerusalem? They did. Notice, O Israel, thou hast destroyed thyself, for thou hast fallen by thine iniquity. Their sufferings are often represented as a punishment visited upon them by the direct decree of God. It is thus that the great deceiver seeks to conceal his own work. By stubborn rejection of divine love and mercy, the Jews had caused the protection of God to be withdrawn from them, and Satan was permitted to rule them according to his will. Is this becoming clearer and clearer as we study along? See, it's really important to study phrase by phrase, isn't it? And to look what the New Testament has to say. Now let's talk about the prince that shall come. I already gave some indications about the prince who shall come. But let's pursue this a little bit closer. The 70-week prophecy describes a prince that shall come. Who is this prince who shall come? Well, we believe that it's the same Messiah, the prince, right? The same Messiah all the way through, the same person. Historicists and futurists agree that the prince would come at the conclusion of the first 69 weeks. However, while historicists believe that the prince that shall come was fulfilled in Jesus or Titus, futurists teach that the prince will be a future world dictator who will rise to power after the rapture of the church. That's the devil's, that's the false prophet's prediction about what's going to happen. And for that reason, the majority of the Christian world is totally deceived about how end-time events will transpire. Now, remember the expression, prince who is to come? That expression is used in the New Testament, and it's used of Christ. Let's pursue this. We previously saw how the prophecy of Isaiah 53 pointed to the vicarious death of the Messiah. That means the death of the Messiah in our place. Now we find in another messianic prophecy the identity of the prince who is to come. Psalm 118, verse 26, is a messianic prophecy. Not talking about some future Antichrist who is to come. Notice that it says, "Blessed is he that cometh in the name of the Lord. We have blessed you out of the house of the Lord." So notice a similar expression. Blessed is he that cometh in the name of the Lord. According to Luke 13, verse 35, Jesus applied this messianic prophecy to himself at his second coming, but also to his triumphal entry into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday, just before he was going to die. Luke 19, 37 to 44 outlines three events in their precise chronological order. Jesus enters Jerusalem on a colt, and the multitude sang, what did they sing? "Blessed is the King that cometh in the name of the Lord." Is that a reference back to Daniel chapter 9? Of course it is. Then Jesus spoke about his rejection by the Jewish nation. By the way, the expression, "he that cometh in the day of the Lord," is verses 37 and 38 of Luke 19. Then Jesus speaks about his rejection by the Jewish nation in verses 39 to 42. And finally, Jesus speaks about the destruction of Jerusalem in verses 43 and 44. The same sequence of events that we find in Daniel chapter 9. Daniel 9:26 has the identical threefold sequence of events in the exact order. The prince comes into Jerusalem in the name of the Lord. Shortly thereafter, he is cut off, and then the city and the temple are destroyed. Psalm 118:26 identifies the one who comes in the name of the Lord as the stone which the builders refused, and has become the head of the corner. Jesus claimed to be this stone. Significantly, after announcing that not one stone would be left upon another in the literal Jerusalem temple, Jesus announced that he would become the head cornerstone of a new spiritual temple, the church. Are you following me or not? In the Old Testament, the word head is used interchangeably with the word prince or ruler. Now, let's talk about shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. We're going by phrase. Let's go back to verse 25 again. Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the command to restore and build Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince, there shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. The street shall be built again and the wall, even in troublous times. And after the 62 weeks, Messiah shall be cut off, but not for himself. And the people of the prince who is to come, who are the people? The Jewish nation. Who is the prince who is to come? It's Jesus Christ. The people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. So who destroys the city and the sanctuary? The people do. So let's go now to the destruction of the city. Gabriel announced that the temple that was to be rebuilt by the decrees of Cyrus and Darius the first, and the city was restored. In other words, Gabriel announced that the temple that was to be built by the decrees of Cyrus, Darius, the city that was restored and rebuilt also by the decree of Artaxerxes. But also, we find a prediction that the city was going to be destroyed. Notice what we find in Daniel chapter 9 and the end of verse 26. The end thereof shall be with a flood, and unto the end of the war desolations are determined. It's talking about the war of Titus and the Roman legions against the city of Jerusalem. Now, the antecedents of the word thereof are city and sanctuary. In other words, when it says, the end thereof shall be with a flood, it's talking about the end of the city and the sanctuary. In other words, the end of the city and the sanctuary would be with a flood. In the Bible, a devastating military invasion is compared to an overwhelming flood. Flavius Josephus, in his classic work, The Wars of the Jews, wrote a vivid description of the destruction of Jerusalem and its temple by Titus and the Roman legions. It is of interest that Josephus used the word war, the very word that appears in the prophecy of Daniel 9:26. Ellen White gave a vivid description of the destruction of Jerusalem in the first chapter of the book, The Great Controversy. Significant also in Daniel 9:26 is the word desolations, which reminds us of the words of Jesus to the Jewish leaders. Behold, your house is left unto you what? Desolate. And he said this immediately before he spoke about the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. We're going to talk a little bit more about the word desolations when we deal with the last half of the next verse, verse 27. Someone might object that the destruction of Jerusalem fell outside the parameters of the 70 weeks. Is that true? Was Jerusalem destroyed within the 70-week period? No. So some people say the destruction of Jerusalem cannot be referred to here. This is true. It's true that the destruction of Jerusalem falls outside the parameters of the 70 weeks, but let's see why. However, though the destruction of Jerusalem fell outside the chronological time frame of the 70 weeks, because the 70 weeks ended in the year 34, it is inseparably linked with events that occurred within that time period, correct? The destruction of the city in the year 70 is linked with events that happened during the period of the 70 weeks. This is reflected in the last phrases of Daniel 9:26 and 9:27. Here's the key. Notice once again verse 26. It says there at the end of the verse, shall destroy the city and the sanctuary, the end thereof shall be with a flood, till the end of the war, desolations are what? Determined. That's important. Notice verse 27. He shall confirm a covenant with many for 1 week, but in the middle of the week he shall bring to end the sacrifice and offering. And on the wing of abomination shall be one who makes desolate, even until the consummation, which is what? Determined. So what does that mean? As we have previously noted, the word determined refers to an event that has been decreed or decided before it occurs. Are you following the point here? So had the destiny of Jerusalem already been determined, had the destruction of Jerusalem already been determined during the 70 weeks? Yes. That is to say, the destruction of Jerusalem and its temple had already been determined by events which took place during the time frame of the 70 weeks, particularly the last week. Is it clear? Now, let's discuss, he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week. Futurists say, see, this prince who is to come is a nasty individual who's going to sit in the Jerusalem temple and he's going to make a covenant with the literal Jews for 1 week. Let's discuss this. Let's ask several questions. Who does the pronoun he refer to in this verse? What does the word confirm mean, and which covenant is being spoken of as confirmed? Who are the many with whom the covenant is confirmed? And of course, is this talking about the last week? When it says 1 week, is it talking about the last week of the 70? The meaning of verse 27 revolves around the identity of the person who confirms the covenant for 1 week. The all-important question then is this: who is this person? Futurists believe, as I mentioned before, he is a future Antichrist who, after the rapture of the church, will make a 7-year pact or covenant with the literal Jews, only to break it in the middle of the week. According to their view, this vile person will halt the sacrificial system in a rebuilt Jerusalem temple and impose a reign of terror for the last 3.5 years of the 7-year tribulation. Is that a counterfeit or what? That is a total counterfeit of what God is trying to teach through this particular prophecy. There are ample reasons to believe that this person is the same as the Messiah who was cut off in verse 26. There is no contextual or syntactical reason to insert the Antichrist into this verse. As we have seen in our discussion above, Jesus Christ fits this prophecy like hand in glove. This fact will become ever clearer as we answer the questions that we formulated at the beginning of this section. What is the meaning of the sentence, "He shall confirm a covenant with many for 1 week"? Now here comes an interesting detail. Without any exception, every time the word covenant appears in Daniel, it refers to God's covenant with his people. Not once does it refer to a political covenant. Daniel 9 verse 4 describes a God who keeps the covenant and mercy to them that love him. Daniel 11:22 refers to Jesus as the Prince of the Covenant. Daniel 9:27 also links Prince and Covenant. Daniel 11:28 and 30 describes the Holy Covenant. And Daniel 11:32 refers to those who do wickedly against the covenant. So in Daniel, the covenant is always God's covenant. Never is it a secular covenant by a secular ruler. The word covenant in Daniel 9:27 does not have a definite article. In other words, it doesn't say the covenant. It says he shall confirm a covenant. However, it is interesting that the King James Version inserts the definite article, the covenant. This is significant because it shows that before the rapture theory, which occurs in the 18th century, early 18th century, before the rapture theory intruded into the church in the 18th and 19th century, the King James translators believed that Daniel 9:27 was referring to whose covenant? Was referring to God's covenant. It is the covenant, not a covenant. Daniel 9, in his prayer, is the only chapter where the covenant name Yahweh appears. This is God's covenant name throughout the Old Testament. The expression, he shall confirm the covenant, is better translated, he shall make strong the covenant. The Hebrew word gabar appears some 328 times in the Old Testament, and the basic meaning is strong or mighty. For example, in Isaiah 9 verse 6, this word is translated, mighty God, everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. So the word really means to make strong. In some sense, this prince is going to make strong the covenant. Now, why would it say that he was going to make strong a covenant? Was the covenant weak, is the big question. Well, what it means is that the prince would put the covenant on firm footing by ratifying the covenant. If the covenant needed to be made strong, was it weak? The answer to this question lies in the fact that the old covenant was ratified with the blood of animals that could not take away sin. Are you following me or not? The new covenant is better and stronger because it is based on better blood, a better priesthood, a better covenant, better promises, a better sacrifice, a better sanctuary. The old covenant could not truly remove sin, but the new covenant does remove sin. The old covenant was made strong by its fulfillment in the New Testament. The old covenant was weak because it could not legally save, because the blood of bulls and goats cannot remove sin. And here's an interesting detail. In fact, Hebrews 7 verse 18 specifically tells us that the old covenant priesthood was weak. Did the covenant need to be made strong? Of course it did. The function of the old covenant was to reveal a Savior to come. And when he came, he made the covenant strong. He ratified the covenant. Now, who are the many? He's going to make a covenant strong with many. Who are the many? In our analysis of verse 26, we saw that the Messiah's cutting off was a vicarious sacrifice. In other words, not for himself, but for us. The word many is key. In the parallel messianic passage of Isaiah 53, we find the following declaration. By his knowledge shall my righteous servant justify what? Many, for he shall bear their iniquities. This prophecy of Isaiah 53 is picked up in the New Testament. See, the problem that futurists have is that they go from the prophecy of the Old Testament, they bypass the New Testament, and they go straight to the end time. That's the problem. But the Gospels are the key that open this prophecy. But because they ignore the Gospels and they put over a 2,000-year gap between week number 69 and week number 70, they don't see the light, the beautiful messianic fulfillment of this prophecy in Jesus Christ. So Mark 10:45 assures us that Jesus came not to be ministered unto, but to minister and to give his life a ransom for, there's the word, many. Once more, the word many is linked with a vicarious sacrifice here. Hebrews 9:28 contains the same idea. So Christ was once offered to bear the sins of many. So who's making the covenant? The Messiah. And who are the many? His people. However, the most important verse for understanding the word many is in Matthew 26:28. When Jesus instituted the Lord's Supper as a memorial of his death until he comes, he said, this is the blood of the New Testament. By the way, don't get all hung up with the word testament from the King James. It's the same word diatheke, which means covenant. So this is the blood of the new covenant, which is shed for many for the remission of sins. All these texts are related by a common idea, a vicarious sacrifice for many. Thus the statement of Daniel 9:26 that the Messiah was cut off, but not for himself, was picked up by the three New Testament writers and applied to Jesus Christ. Also, the fact that Jesus linked his vicarious sacrifice with the word many and covenant. Do you see the same words? A covenant with many. The fact that Jesus linked the word many and covenant is compelling evidence that the New Testament holds the key that unlocks the meaning of the prophecy of the 70 weeks. Let's move on to our final consideration in this section. To which week was Gabriel referring when he explained, and he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week? Well, it's obvious that he's referring to week number what? Week number 70. However, Dr. William Shea, who was my teacher in the seminary, has pointed out that there is a chronological progression of the Messiah's career that is repeated twice in chiastic function in Daniel 9:25 to 27, ending each time with the destruction of Jerusalem. Notice the interesting chiastic structure of Daniel 9:25 to 27. A, the anointing of the Messiah begins the 70th week. B, Messiah is cut off at an unspecified point in the 70th week. C, Messiah's death leads to the destruction of Jerusalem. Are you understanding the structure here? Okay? So, the anointing of the Messiah begins the 70th week. He's cut off, but it doesn't say exactly when in this verse, during the 70th week. And then the Messiah's death leads to Jerusalem's destruction in AD 70. Now, verse 27 repeats the same events in chiastic structure. The Messiah makes the covenant strong, beginning with the 70th week. B, Messiah causes the sacrifice to cease. Now it defines when it's going to cease. In the middle of the week is when he's going to be cut off. And then C, it refers to the destruction of Jerusalem. Do you see the chiasm here between verses 26 and 27? So let's go here. A comparison of verses 25 and 26 with verse 27 reveals that verses 25 through 27 cannot be read in linear fashion, as if one event followed the other in a neat chronological sequence. The fact is that the same material is repeated twice in chiastic fashion. Verse 27 expands upon verses 25 and 26. The A in verse 25 points the date for the initiation of Messiah's ministry during the 70th week, while the A in verse 27 emphasizes that the Messiah made strong the covenant during the 70th week. The B in verse 26 describes the death of the Messiah at some point during the 70th week, but does not specify the exact time. The corresponding B in verse 27 pinpoints the precise time of the Messiah's death in the middle of the 70th week. The C in verse 26 describes the destruction of Jerusalem, as does the C in verse 27. This beautiful symmetry is further evidence that the Messiah, the Prince of verse 25, is the same person as Messiah and Prince in verse 26. You get it? It's amazing. See, when we study this, it's not just enough to read the Bible. We got to think when we're reading. We got to ask why. Where do I find this in some other place in the Bible? We have to be like detectives. You know, one of my favorite television programs, maybe I shouldn't be saying that I watch television. I don't watch very much. But one of my favorite programs is Columbo. Because the emphasis is not on the murder. The emphasis is how he works like a detective, looking for clues. And then he puts all the clues together. Gotcha. Study of Bible is like detective work. You look for a clue here, a clue there. You go to the New Testament, you go to the Old Testament, you go to Genesis, you go to Revelation. You look up all the common terms. You look at the structure. You look at the syntax. You look at the vocabulary. And then when you have all the evidence, you say, I got it. That's what we're doing here. We're studying phrase by phrase so that we understand that the prophecy week is centered in Jesus Christ. It's not centered in the Antichrist. This idea of putting a gap of over 2,000 years between the 69th week and the 70th week, there's no evidence in the Bible of any prophecy having a big gap like that. It's an invention that was done to hide the identity of the true Christ in this prophecy of the 70 weeks.